We live in turbulent times. And the sad news is that the world is on a path to fragmentation. And this is happening because trade policy is no longer driven by economic considerations. It is driven by geopolitics. And I'm going to talk about 3 trends in which this path toward fragmentation is manifesting itself. First, I will talk about the ongoing scramble for raw materials and the policy push towards friendshoring, towards trading just with countries that share our values. Then I'm going to talk about trade sanctions and how these sanctions have reshaped trade flows around Russia. And then I'm going to be somewhat provocative and suggest that while the global dominance of the US dollars has made sanctions more effective, sanctions are giving incentives to new trends that may, in the long run, erode this dominance of the dollar. So you understand why they are worried, right? So scramble for critical raw materials. As hopefully many of you know, if you compare what is needed to build an electric car relative to a combustion car, you will notice that electric cars require a lot of minerals that are not needed, and a lot of metals, so what's now typically termed as critical raw materials, that are not necessary in the same quantities for building a traditional car. So we are talking here about copper, we are talking here about chromium, and we are talking here about graphite. Graphite is the sort of the top brown bar. A lot of graphite, among other things, is needed to build an electric car. If you look at offshore wind, you also need lots of minerals, including rare earth, right? And so our green transition is going to require access to a lot of natural resources. Now, where are these resources located? It's no secret that many of those critical raw materials are controlled to a large extent by China in terms of production. So I mentioned graphite as something that is needed for electric cars. You see graphite here, 2/3 of production being currently taking place in China. Next to graphite to the left, you see rare earth, similar situation. On the top right-hand side, you see gallium and germanium. These are also 2 critical raw materials needed in high-tech industries. What's interesting about them is that China has recently introduced export restrictions, and those export restrictions came a response to American CHIPS Act, which restricted flows of technology to China. And about 2 weeks ago, China introduced restrictions on export of graphite. So as we are moving along the path of green transition, we will need more of those raw materials. And yet, it is likely that we may have difficulties getting them in the presence of geopolitical tensions. Last year, 30% of exports of those critical products were subject to some form of export restrictions. And that's not even counting these restrictions on graphite and gallium and germanium. And a decade ago, there was a negligible fraction that was under export restrictions. Now, where are these materials located? So here you see not the production, but rather location of reserves. This is the location of known reserves. And here we did the following exercise. We split the world into 2 blocks, the Western bloc and the other bloc, based on the patterns of voting at the UN. And the dark bars, the blue bars, show the share of resources that are found in the Western Bloc based on the location of the mines. The pink bars are the location of resources that are found in the other block. And sometimes these bars don't add up to 100 because there was no precise information on location of the reserves. Well, what do you see? Well, you see that among the minerals needed for green technologies, this is the left-hand side part of the graph, majority of reserves are not controlled by the Western Bloc. If you look at other critical raw minerals, the situation is similar, and in particularly, it's striking how little of those resources are controlled by the Western Bloc when it comes, for instance, to rare earth, phosphorus, tungsten, platinum. Now, if you look at what is happening in policy circles, in Europe, we have something called European strategic autonomy. And the initial logic and the initial justification for that policy was to secure access to critical raw materials and prevent countries from weaponizing trade. In other words, prevent countries from exerting pressure through export restrictions. Now, more and more, when you go to Brussels or Berlin, you hear stories about the need of European policymakers to follow the US in restricting flows of technology to and from China. The US has very much embarked on that path. It goes under different names. It's called friendshoring, decoupling, but the idea being that it's good to do business only with countries that share similar values. And as a consequence of that path, US has introduced restrictions on technology flows, restrictions or methods to screen inward investment, and so on and so on. Now, so forth. Why is this risky? Why is this a risky strategy? For two reasons. First, if the world were to break into two blocks, so imagine the world breaks into two blocks along the sort of UN voting patterns. It doesn't matter how you do it, whether you do it along the vote at the UN condemning invasion of Ukraine, or whether you look at the longer term similarity in voting patterns. And then imagine that trade costs between these two blocks go up by 20%. What will happen? Well, if you simulate this in a model, you get a message that's not a surprise to any trade economist. Pretty much everybody loses. And here you see we did this for countries where the EBRD operates. And you see that the biggest losers are countries like Morocco and Kazakhstan. These are countries that have trading links with economies that would find themselves in opposing blocks. Right? So this is one reason why friendshoring, fragmentation is a bad idea. The second reason is that it may not be compatible with green transition, because if you embark on restrictions, these restrictions may be met with retaliation, and we may find ourselves in a world where access to critical raw materials will be restricted before we have built up our own supply routes. Next point. Change in trade patterns associated with trade sanctions imposed on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. It's something that we at the EBRD affectionately call Eurasian roundabout. So if you look at the left-hand side graph, it shows European exports, so exports from the EU and UK to Russia. And the shading, the light, so these are volumes of trade in US $1 billion. The red line is the beginning of the war. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and essentially beginning of sanctions. The light blue color, these are products that are subject to European sanctions. So what you see is a big drop in European exports to Russia. Now, you may ask why the sanctioned goods are still there. Some of this is due to the fact that firms were allowed to complete pre-existing contracts, fulfill pre-existing contracts. Some is due to the fact that in some product lines there is a price cutoff. So for instance, if you sell skiing suits, they are subject to sanctions only if they cost above 300 euros, but not if they are cheaper. Some of it is due to the fact that trade statistics are aggregate. So for instance, you have a product category called sparkling wines, champagne, and is subject to sanctions, but Prosecco is not. Right? So. Now, on the right-hand side graph, you see what has happened with European exports to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia. So you see that there is a big increase after sanctions were introduced, and this increase is particularly pronounced in goods that are subject to European sanctions. And now you can analyze the data from those countries, their exports to Russia, and you see that they export more, much more than they used to, and particularly enthusiastically goods that are subject to European sanctions. Now, before you get very worried, let me point out that the scales of the first graph I showed you are different. So only those of you who are eagle-eyed spotted that the drop in direct exports from Europe to Russia was much larger because of this scale than the increase in exports going via this roundabout. So in practice, the indirect trade that has emerged substitutes only for a relatively small fraction of direct trade that disappeared. Now, what does it mean? Well, it means that this lack of European exports to Russia has created opening for other countries. And you see big increase in exports from Turkey, or Turkey, as one is officially supposed to call the country, as well as entry of increase in Chinese exports to Russia. In both cases, these countries are exporting goods that are subject to European sanctions. Now, these countries are not party to European sanctions, but they are replacing some of the products that were previously obtained from Europe. The third trend, this is the exorbitant privilege. So the dominance of the US dollar, which has made sanctions very effective, and yet it may be the reason why in the long term this dominance may be eroded through sanctions. So as many of you know, Russia has been cut off from the SWIFT payment system. Not completely, but most of its banks have been cut off from the payment system. So, if you cannot make payments in dollars or in euros, how do you trade? Well, if you analyze detailed data on Russian trade, you will see on the right-hand side graph that, about 10 years ago, only 10% of Russian imports from China were denominated in renminbi. Now it's 2/3. So this is this big increase. And you see that this has taken off, particularly after the war started. Moreover, you see that other countries, such as Turkey, UAE, or India, are starting to trade with Russia in their own currencies. Now, these shares for these other countries are still very small, but what's interesting is the increase that is visible in the data since the beginning of the war. Now, if you look at Russian imports from China, you see, if you look at the left-hand side graph, these are volumes of imports in US dollars split by currency. So you see the dark blue at the bottom. This is the volume value of imports denominated in US dollars. And then the light blue, this is the value of imports denominated in renminbi. So essentially, the volume imports in US dollar has gone up a little bit, but there is this giant increase in imports denominated in the Chinese currency. And therefore, when you look at the right-hand side graph, you see that, if you consider shares, you see that renminbi is pushing out US dollar in terms of the share of trade. You may be wondering what type of products are being traded in renminbi. The dark bars, the dark area shows products that are subject to European sanctions and are denominated, whose exports to Russia are denominated in renminbi. So basically, again, you see that products that are subject to European sanctions are more likely to be traded in Chinese currency. Now, what is particularly interesting is the fact that third countries are also using renminbi to invoice export. Right? The share is still small. I mean, if you are sitting in the back, you probably cannot see it. This is the sort of the red area at the top of the graph. It was negligible, not visible before, but after the war started, it's more than 5%. More than 5% of all Russian imports are from third countries, are using Chinese currency. And then you may ask, who is doing that? What countries are doing that? And you see the list of these countries on the left-hand side. So you see, for instance, it's Mongolia, it's Taiwan, it's Philippines, it's Malaysia, it's UAE, it's Thailand. So it's quite a diverse list of countries. And then you may ask, what do these countries have in common? So you see that this increase in trading in renminbi, so denominating trade flows in renminbi, is particularly pronounced among countries that are not participating in sanctions, so countries that are neutral, that's the right-hand side graph, as opposed to the left-hand side graph, which shows countries that participate in sanctions, and countries that have swap lines with People's Bank of China. And you see that essentially this trade takes off particularly enthusiastically after the war has started. And then you can look at this question in a different way. You can look at firms. What is the number of Russian importers, so firms that are doing imports, that are trading in various currencies, that are able to make payments in various currencies? Because you may think, well, maybe these are the giant state-owned enterprises that are able or willing or interested in using renminbi. Actually, it's not just them. You see that the number of Russian importers that process trade flows, that import in renminbi, has increased dramatically from about 1,000 to about 12,000. At the same time, number of firms that process invoices in US dollar or euro has gone down. So hence my conjecture or my hypothesis that yes, the dominance of the US dollar has allowed to make sanctions painful, but there is something going on, right? It also created incentives for countries to trade in different currencies, to use different currencies to invoice imports. And, you know, BRIC countries have also an ambition to launch their own currency. That may not be particularly realistic, but there is more and more interest in using local owned currencies to denominate trade rather than using other currencies. So I've argued that the world is on a path to fragmentation. It's interesting when you talk to firms in, you know, Brussels, well, in Berlin, I was recently, they accept this as something that's already happening, right? It's something that's, it's just happening. We can't do anything. We just need to think about how to adjust. So will protectionism, because in some quarters, this path to fragmentation is used for protectionist purposes as well. Does protectionism, or will protectionism deliver the desired outcomes? So let me look at a study. This was part of actually of a dissertation of Ben Kett, who graduated a couple years ago from Oxford, where we looked at whether the trade war with China has created benefits for American workers. Now, as you know, there has been a lot of discontent and unease about globalization in the US, and that discontent has been manifested in, among other things, in support given to President Trump or candidate Trump. And Donald Trump, during his inaugural speech, mentioned this issue. He said, one by one, the factories shuttered, closed the shutters, right, closed down, and left our shores with not even a thought about the millions upon millions of American workers left behind. And indeed, it is true that if you consider US manufacturing employment, right, it was sort of oscillating around a constant level. And then essentially in the, starting about in 2000 or 2001, when China joined the WTO, it plummeted. There was a big decrease in American manufacturing employment. Trade is part of the answer. Technological progress is a very big part of the answer. But that has led to a lot of discontent and to something that the Nobel Prize laureate Angus Deaton and his co-author Anne Case called death of despair. Essentially, in the US has registered increased mortality among males 50 years of age or older, white, without college educations. And many of them were the people who were affected by the decline in manufacturing. And this increased mortality in the US has been taking place at the time where in other parts of the world, this demographic group has actually enjoyed longer lifespan or expected lifespan. Now, the President Trump, who expressed concern about American workers during his inaugural speech, did not wait long to take action. So what he did in 2018, he started introducing tariffs on US imports, in particularly on China. These tariffs were introduced on 12,000 of products, covering 300 billion of imports, and tariffs on China were on the order of 20%. Of course, the world did not just stand there and take it. China, as well as other countries, retaliated by introducing tariffs on US imports. So what we did in this study, we look at online job advertisements. So we have information on, you know, what seems to be quasi-universe of all the jobs that were posted in the US online. So that's 74 million job advertisements between 2016 and 2018. and they were scrapped from more than 40,000 bulletin boards. And then what you can do is you can link these jobs to locations, right? These online job ads. Now, what you can also do is, if you know the employment structure of each location, which we do, you can look at how these increases in tariffs could have affected those locations. So basically, were these tariffs on output, which protected, in theory, American workers from competition from abroad, or were these tariffs on inputs that are used by industries in given location? And here the very dark areas are the commuting zones which were affected or were exposed to a large extent by those tariff on output, so tariffs that protected them from competition. On the right-hand side, you see locations that were hit by tariffs on input. So in other words, these locations need imported inputs, and they were these inputs were subject to tariffs. And then you can do a similar thing for tariffs on US exports. Again, which locations were exposed, were likely to be affected by those tariffs that were introduced by US trading partners in retaliation. And once you have that information, you can combine it with those online job ads for each area and ask, is there a relationship, right? What was the effect of this policy on online job ads, right? So if they helped American workers, you would expect to see a greater number of online job ads in localities that were more exposed to the policy shock. What you get is exactly the opposite message. What you see is that tariffs on output, so those tariffs that were supposed to protect American workers, had no impact. But tariffs on inputs, which made production more expensive, right, because that's typically what tariffs on inputs do, were associated with lower number of jobs being advertised in affected areas. Similarly, you see that areas that were hit by tariffs on their exports also saw fewer jobs being advertised. And who was hit particular? Low-skilled jobs. So lower-skilled jobs were more likely to see this effect. And if you do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, you see that about 175,000 fewer jobs were posted during that time. So where does it all leave us? Well, sadly, the world is on a path to fragmentation as political consideration, geopolitical considerations trump economic considerations. This fragmentation will be costly. I showed you some simulations that we have done. Similar simulations have been done by the International Monetary Fund and other academics. In all cases, they show fragmentation is a bad idea. It's going to be costly. It's going to lower growth. And it's going to lead to inflationary pressures, as currently production location has been optimized from the cost perspective. Once you start changing location, that will require moving to more costly locations. But perhaps less intuitively, I think this fragmentation may be also detrimental to green transition, as potential retaliation can make it more difficult to access raw materials that are critical for those industries. And as I showed you with the example from the US, protectionism is unlikely to deliver the desired or promised benefits. Thank you.